In the wild, routine can turn deadly in seconds. From remote Russian coasts to Appalachian schoolyards and Canadian rivers, these encounters with grizzly and black bears push survival to the edge. A peaceful picnic, a morning patrol, a fishing trip, all shattered by sudden violence. These are the moments when nature strikes back without warning. Stay with us as we unravel 5 chilling stories of instinct, courage, and raw, unforgiving wilderness. The beach was almost silent, except for the low wash of waves licking the pebbled shore and the call of distant gulls wheeling above. On April 16, 2025, the Ivanov family had chosen this remote spot on the western edge of the Shantar Islands to spend their Easter spring break, far from the world's noise. The day was cool but bright, the sun glinting off the water like shards of glass. Daria, the mother, 38, lay stretched out on a blanket beside the lunch spread, her freckled face tilted up to the sky. Next to her sat Misha, the youngest at 5, cross-legged with a sandwich in hand, swinging his legs in rhythm with his happy idle hum. Pavel, the father, 41, had built a fire pit out of driftwood and stones. He crouched nearby, poking at it with a stick, his back to the forest, unaware of the shifting danger behind the tree line. Lara, their eldest, 14, had kicked off her shoes and was ankle-deep in the cold surf, flicking bits of seaweed with her toes and glancing back now and then at her family. She loved the way the island felt untouched, like a secret place that belonged to them and no one else. They never saw it coming. Without a single warning growl or crack of a branch, a shape exploded from the edge of the trees. The bear was huge, nearly 400 kilograms of fur and muscle, a Siberian brown grizzly, its coat still patchy from winter molt. It was less than 20 meters away when Daria saw it. She had only begun to sit up when the animal closed the distance. Its paws struck like hammers. Daria barely had time to turn toward her son before it was on her. Claws as long as carving knives raked through her chest and shoulder in a single sweep. The force knocked her back into the sand, her scream cut short by a second blow that crushed the side of her face. Misha stood frozen beside her, clutching the torn piece of bread, mouth open, eyes wide and blank. The bear turned to him with terrifying speed, a creature driven not by fear but raw, wild hunger. The swipe took Misha in the chest, lifting his tiny body off the ground and throwing him a meter away. He landed awkwardly on the picnic blanket, limbs at broken angles. There had been no time, no defense, no noise beyond the thud of bodies and the wet crack of breaking bones. Lara screamed, a single wrenching sound that sliced through the wind. Her legs, thin and strong from years of track, carried her away from the horror before she knew she had moved. She ran into the water, splashing furiously, waves slapping her knees and thighs as she pushed forward. Cold bit into her skin. Her mind had only one thought: get away. But the bear saw the movement. It dropped Misha's body and charged. The water slowed it, but not enough. Each stride sent up a wall of spray. Lara's feet slipped on the stones beneath the waves, and she tumbled forward with a gasp. She scrambled to rise, soaked now to the chest, but before she could stand fully, the bear's weight crashed into her from behind. She disappeared beneath the surface in a flurry of churning water and fur. The bear's jaws clamped around her back, dragging her up and out. She writhed, kicked, clawed, but she was no match. Her scream turned into a gurgle as her head was slammed into the stony shallows. The animal pinned her and began to maul her, tearing with its teeth, striking with its claws, until the water ran red and foam bubbled pink. Pavel had heard the first impact and turned, too late. By the time he saw the carnage, his wife was already still, and his son lay unmoving. The fire pit tools dropped from his hands. He roared and ran, unarmed and unthinking, toward the bear as it tore into his daughter. The pain didn't register when the beast turned and met him mid-charge. It stood, towering above him, and swatted him aside like a toy. He flew backward into the rocky shore. Something snapped in his shoulder. His ribs flared with pain. Blood filled his mouth. He rolled, barely conscious, unable to rise. The bear lumbered back to Lara's mangled body, sniffed, then turned toward the food they had left untouched on the blanket. Pavel watched helplessly, gasping, vision doubled and spinning. Every second stretched like hours. He tried to crawl, but his arms betrayed him. The bear sniffed the food, pawed through the remains of the picnic, then sniffed the air again. It seemed agitated now, restless. After a few more seconds, it turned its head toward the woods. Then, as suddenly as it had come, it retreated. It lumbered into the trees without a backward glance, vanishing into the green shadows like a nightmare. When the rescue helicopter appeared an hour later, alerted by an emergency beacon Pavel had managed to trigger on his phone with one trembling hand, it found only one survivor. The medics bundled Pavel onto a stretcher, his face pale and his eyes open wide but unfocused. They worked around the remains of his family with grim efficiency, avoiding each shattered body as best they could. There was nothing to be done for Daria, whose skull had caved in. Nothing for Misha, whose tiny chest had been crushed. Nothing for Lara, whose body was a ruin, half submerged in bloody water. As they lifted Pavel into the helicopter, he stared at the forest, searching. He expected to see eyes watching from the tree line, but the bear was gone. It was never found. Local rangers combed the woods for days. They set traps, baited trails, scoured every inch of shoreline. But there was no sign. Not a single print, as if it had dissolved into the wild, carried away by the wind, or swallowed whole by the forest. The Shantar Islands returned to their silence. The wind blew over the empty beach, washing away the last footprints. Gulls cried overhead. The waves kept moving. And in a hospital bed days later, Pavel lay alone, listening to the quiet hum of machines, surrounded by white walls and the weight of everything he had lost. The call came in just after 9 a.m. on April 28, 2025. A trapper named Silas Petrov radioed in from the upper basin near Coldwater Stream. He'd found a cabin door wide open, no footprints leading away, and the smell of rot on the wind. Darren Wolf's boots were still by the fire. The Rangers knew the name. Darren, 51, had been living off-grid for almost 20 years. Quiet, sharp-minded, a bit reclusive, but never careless. He ran trout lines each spring, dried and smoked the fish by hand, kept his trash burned, his windows barred, and his doors chained. Locals described him as part of the landscape, rugged, rooted, and utterly reliable. The first ranger on the scene, Lieutenant Marlowe, arrived by skiff just after noon. He found the door cracked open, one hinge half torn from the frame. Inside, nothing looked looted or ransacked. The kettle sat on the stove. A journal lay on the table, the last page dated 3 days prior. The fire had gone out, but the hearth was cold in a way that told him it hadn't been touched in over 24 hours. Marlowe moved carefully, weapon drawn, but there were no sounds inside. No movement. The silence felt unnatural. A trail of dark smears led from the threshold, across the wooden floor and out the back. Blood. Not much at first, but enough to set his gut twisting. Outside, the ground was torn up, tracks circling the smokehouse, claw marks scored into the half-rotted logs. On the far side, he found what they were afraid of. Darren Wolf, face down in the moss, shirt shredded, arms stiff with early rigor. What was left of him told a grim story. The radio chatter that followed was clipped, grim. The responding wildlife biologist, Elena Kern, had worked this area for 12 years. She arrived that evening by helicopter, walked the perimeter, and examined the prints around the body. The depth of them, the spacing, the drag lines, the claw marks on bark and wood, it was all unmistakable. Ursus arctos. A grizzly. Not just any bear either. She recognized the gait. The prints were uneven, one paw partially deformed, digits splayed at a crooked angle. This was the same male they'd logged 2 years prior, tagged 418. It had torn up 2 hunting camps last fall. Aggressive, bold, food-conditioned. They hadn't seen it since January. They had hoped it had moved on. It hadn't. Back at the cabin, the team cataloged details. A broken window on the east wall, the only one not covered with metal sheeting. Scattered glass inside suggested the bear had entered through it. On the floor beneath, a spent flare casing. Nearby, drag marks and deep pools of blood confirmed Darren had fired at the bear, missed or startled it, but it wasn't enough. Based on blood spatter and signs of struggle, they reconstructed the scene. Darren had likely been asleep when the bear came. It had smelled the fish. Racks of smoked trout still hung behind the cabin, cured but pungent. Wolf usually buried his scraps deep in a burn pit, but this year he'd grown careless. A mound of discarded fish heads lay behind the smokehouse, half charred but uncovered. Elena crouched over them, inspecting the edges. Some had been gnawed, others pawed apart. The wind had likely carried the scent for miles. That was the mistake. The bear had circled the cabin first. Tracks showed it pacing in the dark, testing doors, rearing up against the walls. It found the window and breached it with a single blow. Darren had grabbed his flare gun, probably believing the flash and noise would drive the animal off. He'd gotten one shot off inside. They found the scorch mark high on the far wall and a shallow burn across the rafters. It hadn't stopped the bear. He must have tried to flee, running barefoot across the floor and out the front. The blood trail supported that theory, but the bear was faster. It had followed him outside, tackled him by the smokehouse. The area was a mess of fur, blood, and earth torn up by claws and boots. Based on the damage to the corpse, deep punctures in the back, ribs crushed, chunks of muscle missing from the neck and thigh, it had mauled him thoroughly, likely for several minutes before retreating. The team didn't think it had fed for long. The kill site was chaotic, not controlled. Elena suspected the bear wasn't hunting for food anymore. It was defending a territory it had come to associate with meals. Human scent had become part of its hunger. They set traps that same day. Nocturnal trail cams were rigged to trees. Trained marksmen were posted in towers. It took 6 nights. On the 7th, just before dawn, 418 returned. It circled the smokehouse, sniffed the ground, approached the baited trap, and paused. The sedative failed to take hold quickly enough. The bear bolted, wounded by a tranq dart, and charged the bait crew's hide. A ranger named Tomliak put 2 rounds into its chest at 20 meters. The bear collapsed by the stream it had followed in, blood smearing the rocks. It was over. But the story had only begun to spread. Darren's remains were cremated 3 days later in Nikolaevsk. A few locals showed up. Most knew him only from supply runs or his rare visits to town, but his death struck a nerve. He had been part of the wilderness. He understood it, respected it, and still, it had taken him. That was the part people couldn't accept. He knew better. But familiarity had dulled his caution. In the wild, comfort was the beginning of danger. The final report was filed in early May. It included the autopsy, photographs of the kill site, the bear's weight and condition, and a timeline of events reconstructed through GPS data, witness accounts, and biological evidence. It was clean, professional, but every line of it spoke of panic and violence. Wolf's journal entries, collected by the investigation team, painted a portrait of slow decline. The last week had been unusually warm. Fish were abundant. He wrote about long days drying trout and a growing sense that locking everything up might not be necessary this season. On the final page, his handwriting had loosened. He had written one final thought, a quiet conviction born from fatigue or false peace. It was the belief that everything was fine. His cabin still stands by the stream, though the smokehouse has since been cleared. A new sign is nailed to the dock, stark and unmissable. Bear danger. Do not leave food scraps. Locals still speak of Darren Wolf. They mention how his boots were still dry when they found them, that he never had time to put them on. Some say he probably thought it was a dream at first. That slow, surreal moment before reality becomes horror. But it wasn't the bear that broke the rules. It was the slow slide into routine, the quiet, creeping belief that danger had passed. That was what cost him everything. Now, every spring, the wind that moves through Coldwater Stream carries a faint, smoky scent. Some swear they can still smell trout hanging from empty racks. And they remember. The morning had started like any other in the quiet Appalachian town of Lanesville, where the air still carried the soft, loamy scent of wet earth from the night's rain. At Hollow Ridge Elementary, children poured out of the building in uneven lines, their voices rising into the spring air with the boundless energy of morning recess. The schoolyard filled with the sounds of shrieking laughter, running feet, bouncing rubber balls, and the sharp blasts of whistle commands from Coach Jared Wilkins. At 38, Jared had taught PE here for nearly a decade. He was the kind of teacher who ran laps with the kids rather than standing on the sidelines, the kind who kept extra gloves in his pockets for anyone who forgot theirs in the winter, the kind who had never once called in sick. He believed, quietly, unwaveringly, that showing up mattered more than anyone realized. At 6'1", with a runner's frame and a calm, even energy, Jared was a steady figure on that yard, standing near the orange cones that marked the boundary lines. watching the second graders organize themselves into a chaotic game of tag, while fifth graders kicked a soccer ball across a muddy stretch of grass. None of them, not the teachers, not the children, sensed what had already breached the perimeter of their small, safe world. To the south of the playground, beyond the wire fence and a row of sagging shrubs, a shadow moved at the edge of the tree line. Quiet, uncertain. A large black bear had wandered down from the ridge, drawn by the scent of garbage from a fast food bag left in an open dumpster behind the cafeteria. Its instincts had dulled after days of easy scavenging. Its fear of humans had thinned, weakened by hunger and proximity. Its dark eyes caught the sudden glitter of movement across the open yard. No one noticed at first, not even Jared. The figure was slow-moving, partly obscured by brush. When it stepped through the gap in the fence where the latch had rusted through over the winter, the initial response wasn't panic, but curiosity, even laughter. A third-grade boy pointed, his shout lost in the commotion, drawing more eyes. But there was no alarm. Not yet. The bear's shape, loping and heavy, looked exaggerated in the morning light, as if someone had put on a costume, a prank maybe. A joke played by high school seniors from down the road. For a few long seconds, that was the story everyone told themselves. Even Jared, squinting into the sunlight, began walking toward the commotion, his voice raised in firm encouragement, calling for the kids to settle down, to give space. They crowded toward the fence in a wave of fascination. Then the moment turned. The shift came like a blade through fabric when the bear lowered its head and moved, not away from the children, not back into the trees, but forward, with a sudden deliberate urgency that shattered any illusion. Laughter snapped into screaming. Children stumbled over each other, crying out, slipping on the grass as they scrambled for the doors. Some fell, some froze. The bear's pace quickened, zeroing in on the confusion, chasing motion. Jared didn't hesitate. He didn't think. He ran, not away, but toward the threat, toward the fence, toward the scattering children. He planted himself between them and the bear, a human wall against chaos, his whistle bouncing off his chest, his sneakers digging into the soft ground. His arm shot up, signaling for the kids to move, his voice cutting through the shrieks, still calm, still focused on getting them to safety. The bear didn't slow. It charged, claws tearing through the grass, mouth slightly open, breath huffing in short, sharp bursts. When it struck hard. Jared went down beneath it like a felled tree, the impact knocking the wind from his lungs. Pain exploded in his leg as teeth tore into muscle. His thigh burned, his pants darkened with spreading blood. He twisted and kicked, his boot slamming into the bear's shoulder. It snarled, raked at his jacket, ripped fabric from his side. He tried to crawl back, tried to push himself between the children and the threat just a little longer. Even through the panic, even through the pain, Jared's voice rose again. He shouted for the last stragglers to run. Every ounce of his focus stayed on them. Not on the blood soaking into the soil, not on the bear's black eyes, not on the world narrowing to teeth and claws and noise, but on the kids. From the far side of the schoolyard, two custodians, Robert and Annie, both older and armed only with instinct, burst from the maintenance shed with an industrial air horn salvaged from a bus garage the previous year. The sound split the air in an ear-splitting scream. The bear flinched, turned, hesitated. Jared lay motionless, hands clenched into the muddy ground, jaw tight with pain. His chest rose and fell in short, ragged breaths, eyes fixed on the retreating shape as if sheer focus could keep it from turning back. The horn blasted again, louder this time. The bear wheeled around, wheeled hard, then bolted, lumbering back the way it came, slipping through the broken fence and into the underbrush, vanishing into the trees like smoke after a fire, as if it had never been there at all. Paramedics arrived 6 minutes later. Jared was conscious, pale, shaking, soaked with mud and blood, but still alert, his voice low and hoarse as he asked after the kids again and again. His leg was a wreck of punctures and torn muscle, the fabric shredded away in crimson flaps. They stabilized him quickly, bundled him onto the stretcher, and rushed him to Lanesville Regional, where he was listed in serious but stable condition. The news spread fast. By noon, the school was under lockdown. Wildlife officers swept the surrounding woods, classrooms filled with trembling hands, red eyes, the stunned silence of children trying to make sense of something they'd never forget. Teachers held them close. Some read aloud from books as if routine could stitch the world back together. Others just sat beside their students, quiet and present, trying to soften the rawness of what they'd seen. Authorities tracked the bear through the forest over the next 24 hours. Prints and fur caught on fence wire confirmed it had been in the area for at least a week, moving from one dumpster to the next. Hunger had worn down its boundaries. Each meal pulled it a little closer to town. It had learned to stop fearing the scent of people. 2 days later, it was located and tranquilized in a ravine 5 miles east of Lanesville. Wildlife teams relocated it to a preserve deep in the Appalachians, far from homes, schools, or the smell of fast food. No one pushed for euthanasia. The bear had done what bears do. But the damage it left behind, the fracture in routine, the violent re-entry of wild into safe, couldn't be moved or contained. It had already settled into memory. Jared Wilkins spent 2 weeks in the hospital. There were surgeries, physical therapy, pain that made sleep a fragile thing. The bite would scar. The muscle damage meant he might walk with a limp, maybe for good, but he would walk again. Cards arrived by the dozens. Bright colors, uneven lines, blocky handwriting, drawings of bears and playgrounds and smiling stick figure teachers with whistles. The kids called him Bear Coach. The name stuck, both lighthearted and heavy, a kind of reverence in its silliness. Some students flinched when doors slammed. Some couldn't look at the woods the same way. Others turned fear into fascination, sketching bears in the margins of notebooks, asking questions about claws and hibernation and habitats. The fence was repaired, new safety protocols were posted, lock drills became routine, but the edge lingered. In Lanesville on a misty April morning, the line between wild and safe blurred for just a few terrifying minutes. The bear was gone. Jared would heal. But the imprint remained, in memory, in scars, in the slight hush that fell whenever someone mentioned the day recess changed everything. It was just after dawn in Ussuri Krai, the early spring air still thick with mist that rolled low along the forest floor, cloaking the narrow service roads in a pale, shifting veil. Officer Kirill Zaitsev, a quiet but sharp-eyed 39-year-old with 11 years in the service, sat behind the wheel of the patrol jeep, guiding it along a winding gravel track bordered by dense birch and pine, the tires crunching over frost-hardened stones. His partner, Ivan Petrov, 42, broader and more weathered from 2 decades in the force, rode beside him, scribbling notes in his logbook with practiced indifference, the kind of calm that came from seeing almost everything the Russian Far East could throw at a man. Their shift had begun without incident, a routine sweep past border fencing and known poaching trails, checking abandoned cabins, logging clearings, and the rusting carcasses of old military checkpoints long forgotten by anyone but the bears and the patrolmen. It had been quiet, eerily so. Even the crows hadn't cried that morning, and the only movement had come from the underbrush twitching with the wind, or the occasional fox darting across the road. Neither man spoke much of the silence because, in places like this, words could hang too heavily, as if the forest might overhear. The jeep rolled around a bend and slowed, as Kirill spotted something ahead. At first it looked like a trick of the light, a large shadow just off the tree line, unmoving, too solid to be mist or rock. Then the figure stepped forward into the open, and the air inside the vehicle seemed to stop moving altogether. A grizzly bear, huge even by the standards of Ussuri predators, emerged onto the road, its fur thick and dark with streaks of old mud and pine sap, its head low, shoulders shifting like boulders beneath a hide stretched tight over raw power, its eyes fixed directly on the vehicle. Kirill instinctively eased his foot off the brake, bringing the jeep to a crawl, while Ivan looked up from his notes and muttered something under his breath, though neither of them moved to open a door or reach for a weapon just yet. Encounters like this weren't unheard of, but this bear was different. It looked wrong, not curious, not even cautious, but agitated, as though it had already decided that something here was a threat. The engine idled low, but the sound seemed to irritate the bear, which swung its head and stepped closer, its movement too smooth, too purposeful. Without warning, it charged. The bear launched itself forward with terrifying speed, not a lumbering shuffle, but a violent sprint that covered the ground in seconds. Before either man could fully react, it reared up and smashed its claws down onto the windshield with a force that cracked the glass from corner to corner in a spiderweb of impact. the sound of claws on reinforced plastic echoing like gunshots inside the confined space of the cabin. Kirill cursed and instinctively floored the gas, his hands locked on the wheel as the tires spun for traction, but the bear surged again, slamming its full weight onto the hood, the metal groaning beneath it, crumpling inward as the front grille caved and the vehicle's nose dipped from the sudden mass. The windshield flexed and bulged inward, the center starting to give as the claws punched deeper, flinging shards of safety glass across the dashboard. Ivan reached for the radio with one hand while bracing himself against the shaking console with the other, his fingers trembling as he keyed the mic, trying to get out a location through a burst of static and overlapping interference, his voice almost drowned by the roar of the bear and the grinding of metal as Kirill fought to keep the vehicle moving in a straight line. The Jeep lurched forward, the bear still on the hood, its mouth open now, steaming breath coating the cracked windshield, its eyes wild and locked onto the shapes behind the glass. For a moment, Kirill thought it might smash through entirely and drag them both out piece by piece into the dirt road that now blurred under the tires. The steering wheel bucked in his hands as he hit a patch of loose gravel, the whole vehicle slewing sideways for a terrifying second before the tires caught again, and he yanked the wheel hard to correct. The bear nearly losing its footing before, finally, suddenly, it jumped off. The relief was instant but fleeting as the weight left the hood and the Jeep surged forward, unburdened, now speeding uncontrollably down the narrow path. Kirill had to fight to regain control, pumping the brakes carefully to avoid spinning out entirely, his pulse pounding so hard he could feel it in his teeth. Behind them, the bear stood in the road, not chasing now but watching, its breath heaving in great clouds, its claws slick with dust and resin. The radio crackled again, and a voice finally answered, garbled but there. Ivan relayed coordinates through short gasps, eyes still on the shattered glass in front of him, blood from a shallow cut on his temple dripping down onto his collar. They didn't stop until they were 10 kilometers down the road, far enough that even the forest didn't feel like it held its breath anymore. The Jeep wheezed to a halt, its front grille crushed like a paper cup, one headlight hanging loose, the hood warped. But both men were alive, though neither one spoke for several minutes, too shaken to frame the experience in words that would make any sense. Later at the outpost, wildlife officers reviewed the damage and checked the onboard camera that had continued recording through the entire event. The footage showed the bear clearly, too large, too aggressive, its behavior erratic. Experts believed it had been displaced by illegal logging deeper in the valley, driven out of its territory, likely hungry and suffering from early signs of stress-induced behavior shifts. That bear wasn't curious. It was defending what little ground it thought it had left. Patrols in the area doubled. Signs went up near known trails warning of recent sightings. A biologist named Tatiana Sokolov, who had studied Ussuri bears for 15 years, told the officers that when a bear acted like that, it was usually the end of something. Territory, dominance, safety. And what came next was either death or retreat. The bear was spotted once more, 5 days later, farther north, but never again after that. Whether it had moved on or succumbed to starvation or injury, no one could say. Kirill returned to duty the following week, his hand still bearing the bruises from gripping the wheel too tightly, while Ivan carried a small scar just above his right eye, a reminder of how close they had come to being torn apart on a routine patrol in the middle of nowhere. The tide had just turned when Tucker Vance, 33, beached his narrow kayak on a mossy bank at a salmon-thick creek mouth, surrounded by the Alaskan wild. The late morning light cut through spruce and alder, and the air smelled of salt, cedar, and fish. Tucker, lean and dark-haired, was well-conditioned from years of guiding, though he'd taken the season off to record isolated salmon runs with drone footage for a small nature channel. He'd charted the currents, monitored run forecasts, and checked his gear twice. What he hadn't seen, what no one could warn him about, was that he had come ashore near a Kodiak bear's feeding site, hidden upriver. He launched the drone, watching it rise like a silver insect, its camera feeding him crisp shots of salmon below. A large fish thrashed free from a submerged snag, and though Tucker's eyes turned toward it, he didn't notice the bear lying in wait just beyond the tree line. The Kodiak had been crouched, tracking fish with patience. The splash startled it, and in the confusion it saw the unfamiliar figure by the water's edge, the drone above, the unnatural scent of packs and boots. To the bear, Hungry and food-stressed, it looked like intrusion. It charged. Tucker heard branches crash before seeing the blur of brown explode from the underbrush. He froze for half a second, then ran. But the gravel shifted beneath him, and the bear hit him like a truck. It knocked him over with a grunt that burst from his lungs. He tried to scramble away, but the bear was already on top, its breath hot against his face. The first bite came down hard on his left forearm as he raised it instinctively, the bear's jaws closing with bone-crushing force. He didn't have time to scream. It shook its head, dragging him across the dirt, shredding his jacket and ripping the pack's strap. It pawed at his side next, claws raking through the bag, tearing into his gear. Something cracked under its weight. He couldn't tell if it was plastic or bone. He kicked at its belly, trying to reach the flare clipped to his hip, but the bear shifted, moving off with heavy breaths. It lumbered backwards, sniffing at the scattered gear, then turned toward the stream where the salmon churned. The smell of blood disoriented it, and after a moment it moved off into the reeds, pushing through the stalks with none of the stealth it had used to approach. Tucker stayed down, barely breathing, vision blurring as he cradled his arm and felt blood soaking his sleeve. When he finally moved, he dragged himself to the kayak, gritting his teeth against the pain and reaching for the waterproof case under the seat. The static-filled click of the radio felt like salvation. He gave his position with numb fingers, waiting as cold seeped into his bones. He couldn't tell how much time passed before the chopper came, but when it did, he wept silently, still lying beside the kayak with the ruined drone beside him. In the hospital, surgeons said the damage could have been worse. The bite hadn't snapped the ulna completely, but tendons were shredded, and nerve damage meant partial loss of function for months. They cleaned his wounds, stitched the skin, and told him he was lucky. Most didn't survive. The drone recorded the charge up until the moment the bear collided with the camera, cutting to static. Wildlife officers said the bear was likely food-stressed from poor salmon yields. The video was never released. Local guides recognized the spot and said there had been signs of bear activity for weeks, though few ventured that far up the estuary alone anymore. Tucker's story passed quickly among coastal camps. The land had reminded everyone what it meant to be prey. The morning air was clean along the Athabasca River, as Devin Clark, 46, worked his fly line with practiced rhythm, his boots planted in a shallow pocket of gravel near the river's edge, his breath visible in the chilled air. A financial analyst by profession but an outdoorsman at heart, Devin had driven up from Edmonton with two old friends for a long weekend of fly fishing, something they did every spring when the thaw opened the river and the trout moved into the bends. The three men had fanned out along a quiet meander in the riverbank, the kind of place where the only sounds were the whip of a cast and the rush of water around smooth stones. Devin had taken the inside curve closest to the brush line, where the forest pressed up against the riverbank, his focus locked entirely on the glint of the fly as it danced above the water. He didn't hear the first twig snap. He didn't see the branches sway. He only felt the sudden change in the air, the way the birds went silent, the instinctive chill that crawled up his spine before the underbrush exploded in a fury of noise and motion as a grizzly bear burst from the thicket less than 15 feet behind him. The bear was massive, mottled with mud, its fur hanging in clumps along its shoulders, eyes wide and dark and locked on the nearest threat. Devin, who had turned just in time to see the blur of brown muscle charging through the scrub. He tried to run, but his foot caught in the rocky riverbed and he slipped, crashing down onto one knee as the bear closed the distance in 3 strides. It didn't hesitate. Its jaws clamped onto the heel of his boot, crunching down hard enough to tear the leather and twist his leg sideways with brutal force. Then it pulled. The weight of the animal and the angle of the bank combined, and Devin was yanked backward into the water, his body sliding over the gravel with a scraping noise that cut through the chaos. The river was ice cold, numbing him instantly, and he thrashed to stay upright as the bear dragged him deeper, water pouring into his waders, his arms flailing for balance, for something to hold on to. The bear's front paws splashed down beside him, claws gouging the riverbed and sending up clouds of silt. Devin kicked hard, twisting his free leg toward the bear's chest, catching it once near the shoulder, but it didn't back off. Its head darted forward, snapping at his hip, then lunged again, this time raking a paw down the side of his torso, cutting through fabric and skin with sickening ease. He screamed, but the sound vanished beneath the roar of the current and the snarling of the bear. Blood mixed with river water, swirling in ribbons that clouded around him as he struggled to keep his head above the surface. On the bank, his friends were yelling, though their voices barely registered. One of them had scrambled for a can of bear spray. The other was already throwing rocks, big ones, anything he could lift and hurl. The first stone struck the bear's hindquarters, making it grunt and shift but not release. The second caught it near the neck, and the third, the biggest, cracked hard against its ribs. It let go for a moment, turning its head, snarling, distracted just long enough for the pressurized hiss of bear spray to hit its face in a bright orange plume that blew sideways in the wind. The effect was immediate. The bear reeled back, shaking its head violently, water and foam flying as it stumbled sideways into the shallows, snorting and pawing at its own face. It turned in a jerking, clumsy arc, then bolted upstream through the bushes, crashing away into the trees as fast as it had come, leaving silence in its wake except for the fast-beating river and the desperate, ragged gasps of Devon as he struggled to pull himself from the freezing water. His friends dragged him out, one on each arm, laying him on his back on the pebbled bank, his soaked clothes sticking to torn skin, his leg twisted and bleeding. The cold had sunk deep into him, deeper than shock alone, and it took both of them working fast to strip off his waders, wrap him in emergency blankets, and call for help on the satellite phone they'd nearly left behind. The wait for the chopper felt endless, and Devon shivered uncontrollably, his body going stiff with the onset of hypothermia. But he didn't slip away. Paramedics treated him for blood loss and cold shock, then airlifted him to the nearest hospital, where doctors confirmed torn ligaments, puncture wounds, and deep lacerations, but, miraculously, no broken bones. The boot, though shredded, had taken the brunt of the bite, and the freezing water had slowed the bleeding. He spent 4 days in the hospital and weeks in recovery. Wildlife officers said the bear had likely been moving downstream, following the scent of fish and campfire oils, and had stumbled upon the group by accident, reacting with panic and aggression when it saw people standing near its path. They tracked prints for 2 miles before losing the trail in the dense forest. Devon didn't give up the sport. Later that season, healed but changed, he returned to the same bend in the river, this time with a professional guide, a belt heavy with bear spray, a loud whistle around his neck, and a deeper respect for the invisible line between solitude and survival.